So the best thing we can do is prove people wrong, and I think we're doing that methodically, step by step, quietly in the background, just getting it done. And I think the more proof points that come out from that methodical stepwise execution, hopefully the more sort of value will start to be recognized in Vulcan again as we deliver on this.
Hello and welcome to the Market Bull podcast. Please note, topics and stocks discussed in this podcast are not financial or investment advice. Dr Francis Wedin is the executive chair of Vulcan Energy, which is listed on the ASX and Frankfurt exchanges. Now, Vulcan Energy is aiming to decarbonise the transition to electric vehicles through its world-first Zero Carbon Lithium Project for EV batteries and its focus on renewable energy in the business. Francis discussed how the company has progressed down this path and the absorption direct lithium extraction process that they are developing. Francis also highlighted the upcoming milestones at the company and what investors can expect over the next 12 months. So hello, I'm Ben Kostrich and this is the Market Bull podcast. Joining me today on the show is Dr. Francis Wedin, the chairman of Vulcan Resources currently, but he was the managing director and CEO and a founder of part of the technology at the company. So welcome to the show, Francis.
Thanks very much for having me on, Ben.
So Vulcan Energy, I'm sure many listeners are familiar with the company, given the 2020, the emphatic rise and almost the perfect stock in that era. And there's been a fair bit of, volatility within just markets generally, but within share prices and companies. But I mean, putting that all aside to a moment, I mean, you've had quite a rich background within lithium and mining, but I mean, they're two very different components, you could say. But what is your history and background and getting you to the position you are at Vulcan Energy?
Sure. So I'm actually a geologist by background, and this is the second lithium company that I've been involved in starting. So I actually started my career in the lithium space in hard rock back in 2014. And essentially acquired some ground in the Pilbara, which was a spodumene prospect called Linus Find, which ended up being in a listed entity called Dakota Minerals, and we made a discovery there, a high grades at surface spodumene discovery, which ended up being the extension of the Pilgangoora resource and ended up being taken over by Pilbara Minerals. So that was sort of my first foray into lithium, which was successful. It was a good result for shareholders. During that journey, I appreciated the speed at which hard rock could come to market. And by the way, when I first started in the hard rock lithium space, there were a lot of naysayers about hard rock. So they were saying that brines essentially were going to ramp up production quickly from South America and swap the market with low-cost lithium, and hard rock had no chance. So this is back when essentially it was only Greenbushes that was in production. Obviously, I gained an appreciation for hard rock during that journey that, it can get into production very, very quickly and meet that market response, which it did, and ended up taking substantial market share, including the asset that we were working on. But for Lithium 2.0, which is what I wanted to start, I wanted to start a zero carbon lithium company. So Vulcan was essentially starting with zero carbon lithium on a whiteboard, working backwards from there. How do we use existing technologies bolted together to decarbonize lithium production? Because I recognized through my journey in hard rock lithium that the hard rock lithium conversion process was extremely carbon intensive. So that's when I got into brines, and I realized that there were these existing technologies which were commercially used but not very well known about outside of a couple of companies, such as this adsorption type direct lithium extraction, which were very low energy and very low reagents consumption as well, but they needed heat to work. And I was looking at ways we could use renewable heat instead of fossil gas, which is what the incumbents are using. And that led to the genesis of Vulcan as a heated or geothermal lithium brine in Central Europe, which is what we're developing now and going into our first phase of commercial production.
But I mean, even saying, zero carbon and putting on a whiteboard, I mean, I know that there's directions and incentives to get to this image, but I guess the reality check is how. And I mean, even workshopping and brainstorming and bringing these technologies together, I mean, that would have been quite a tedious and again, ongoing process. But I mean, how did you even start pulling these pieces of the puzzle together to develop this strategy that Vulcan Energy is now down and pursuing?
Well, it was sort of stepwise. So we started off with a with sort of a desktop level study, and then we went into a scoping study, and we looked at all the technologies, and we had a clear brief. So the brief was, we want this to be zero fossil fuels in the process, and we want it to be commercial technology. So we didn't want to go through a whole R&D cycle. We just didn't have time for that. And so that led us to filter out other types of so-called direct lithium extraction, or DLE, such as ion exchange, solvent extraction, membranes, which all have their respective merits, but none of them are commercially proven. And led us to adsorption, which is the only type of commercially proven direct lithium extraction technology. So there was a scoping exercise, if you like, and we started with the technology and then looked for the right asset instead of starting with the asset and looking for the right technology. And that led us to the Upper Rhine Valley in Germany, also into France as well, which is a commercial geothermal brine producing region. So they're already pumping this brine up to the surface. They were producing renewable energy from it, from existing plants. And they knew that there was lithium in the brine, but they didn't know about adsorption DLE. So then Vulcan was about putting together our knowledge and expertise in the space on lithium extraction together with the geothermal industry in Germany. And that's when I reached out to a chap called Dr. Horst Kreuter, who was a geothermal expert, had developed some of these geothermal projects already. And it was really about combining those two worlds of lithium and geothermal.
And the absorption, because DLE, direct lithium extraction, is really where the industry is wanting to focus it and go towards. It's just, again, quite a difficult process because, as we know, lithium really is... we're wandering into a space that we're trying to really understand it and uncover it and get to these incredible quotas of electric vehicles. But before then, everyone's really trying to figure out how to go. But the absorption side of it is quite interesting. And you alluded to it before we started talking, was there's quite a bit of opportunity and uniqueness about that. So can you drill down and maybe explain that process to listeners that are not really familiar with the DLE and the absorption processes? Sure.
So this is a process that was invented in the 70s by Dow, which became Dow DuPont and is now DuPont. But it's a process that's older than me, essentially. It was invented in the 70s. And it was commercialized, lithium extraction adsorption was commercialized by FMC, which is now Livent, in 1996. So it's been around for well over 2 decades commercially. Essentially, you have a brine, which is lithium rich, and the brine gets passed through a series of columns, and these columns are loaded with an adsorbent resin, so a series of beads. And the lithium, driven not by reagents but by heat and salinity within the brine, the lithium is driven onto the surface of the adsorbent, of the resin. And then the brine washes through and is reinjected minus most of the lithium, over 90% of lithium. You then wash off the lithium using fresh water. So once again, it's a salinity-driven process, but the other way. So the lithium is following the salinity gradient into the fresh water. And then you've got an upgraded, very pure lithium chloride eluate, as it's called. And then what's becoming increasingly common in the industry is, instead of using solar evaporation to finally concentrate the lithium, you use mechanical concentration effectively. So using the heat that's available, in our case, geothermal heat, and using things like RO to process the lithium into a lithium chloride concentrate, which is about 40%. And then you have the option there to do a lithium carbonate step first, or you can do what we're doing, which is electrochemically convert it directly to a lithium hydroxide, which has a lower carbon footprint in that process. So it's actually a very simple process. So we have a lot of oil and gas guys in our team who have come from executing these large multi-billion-dollar energy projects, integrated energy projects. And they look at this and say, this looks like a simple oil and gas project, just minus the hydrocarbons, basically. So, it's wells, it's brine pipelines, it's water treatment, and then there's a chemical refining step. And it's just integrating those steps together, which is what these guys are used to doing in their industries.
Well, we're seeing this almost transition or this synergy between oil and gas companies now almost getting more interested in lithium, maybe more so because they have to, given the looming, net zero and lack of using oil and gas traditionally going forward. But I mean, bringing their experience and expertise in, we're seeing this across the board. I mean, pursuing them and getting them on board, them saying it's simple. I mean, clearly there's a fair bit of work and development and negotiations and just a lot to happen in the industry. But what else are you seeing evolve within those sorts of movements from oil and gas specialists into the lithium space?
Well, it's really interesting because, I mean, oil and gas really wants to decarbonise. They've all got decarbonisation mandates. And traditionally, more recently, they've been getting into things like solar and wind over the last couple of decades as part of that. But that's not really part of their core skill set. So there's a bit of an awkward marriage there of oil and gas trying to get into renewables. With this type of, in our case, geothermal energy and the lithium extraction, as I said, there's so many similarities. The drilling is basically the same. We're using the same gear. We have 2 onshore oil and gas rigs effectively in-house, which should be doing our drilling for us. The reservoir engineering is very similar. The management of the geology and the managing of the pipelines on the surface and the integration of the overall project is very, very similar. So suddenly they've got an opportunity to get into a space that they really know very well, and they have an advantage there. And it's also, the lithium market is also getting to that point where it's interesting for an oil and gas company. The amount of revenues, the profits, they are getting to that scale and margins which are interesting for oil and gas. So, and this, to be honest, this type of project is not really suited to a traditional miner, a hard rock miner. They just don't have the right skill set. So I think watch this lithium space very carefully, because we've seen, Exxon, we've seen Schlumberger, the oil field services company, Koch Industries, large oil and gas companies like that starts to invest in this space, in adsorption type DLE, and start to really, build these projects, particularly in North America as well. So at the moment, we're seeing the traditional lithium companies build them. So Livent is obviously a big producer. You've got SQM, Albemarle as well, also going to this space. Eramet, the French mining company, they're about to finish their first adsorption type DLE project. But the next wave, I think, is going to be a much bigger wave. And I think it's going to be very well executed at scale because of those oil and gas guys coming in as well.
I think you nailed it on the head. There's never really been this really appetite for the big oil and gas companies, given that, well, there's never really been the scale. But now we're seeing this real, I want to get involved. There is genuine opportunity for me to start making some good returns on it. And that feeds into them wanting to specialize and almost translate their skills from oil and gas into the lithium extraction. And that's where we're seeing a lot of hiccups, at least in the lithium industry, with these projects being delayed and just this lack of understanding, predominantly maybe because a lot of them are miners and the lithium extraction process is more chemically founded, as it should be. And that's where there's this almost, I don't know what we're doing, we're trying to figure it out. And that's sort of presenting quite an interesting opportunity. But I mean, focusing on Vulcan Energy, I mean, you just said a few things about the projects, but I can imagine going through the wave of Vulcan already. You went up emphatically, and then there's been this sort of restructuring of markets, and almost quite a lot of naysayers come out, and everyone loves it when you start getting ahead of yourselves. There's always that, say in Australia, tall poppy syndrome. You have to cut them back down to level. And I can imagine you've had to deal with a lot of just challenging people's, I guess, assumptions about the company. So what sort of myths or accusations have you had to dispel within what Vulcan Energy is achieving, and therefore what can investors and people expect coming out in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, well, I start off by saying we try not to follow the markets too closely as best we can.
It is. It's very emotionally.
Very emotionally. And you go a bit mad doing that, I think, because I think markets will always be right in the long term, but I think they can be very wrong in the short term. And as you said, 2021 was a very special year for a number of companies, and a number of companies probably got ahead of themselves. And now there's probably been too much of a pullback. I think we see ourselves as quite mature now as a business, as a project. We're going into that execution stage now, and the best way we can prove people wrong, any naysayers, if there are any naysayers now, is just to execute, and to execute our phase 1 commercial project, which is an integrated renewable energy and lithium chemicals project, which will produce 24,000 tons per annum lithium hydroxide from that project in the center of Europe. we'll be selling to Europe's leading automakers, Volkswagen, Stellantis, Renault, but also battery makers like LG, cathode makers like Umicore. There's a reliance on this project being built in Europe, and it's very important geopolitically, as part of that critical raw materials, but also renewable heats into local communities, which is what we'll be producing as well. So the best thing we can do is prove people wrong, and I think we're doing that methodically, step by step, quietly in the background, just getting it done. And I think the more proof points that come out from that methodical stepwise execution, hopefully the more sort of value will start to be recognized in Vulcan again as we deliver on this. And what we've been doing is, we've got a team of about 320 people now. We built up this really world-leading team with that oil and gas expertise, as I mentioned, building large infrastructure projects, chemical engineering expertise, lithium extraction, processing expertise, renewable energy expertise on the geothermal side. So we've got some really good people, and I believe that the people are really the most important part of, and validation as well, but the most important part of delivering on this, getting this done. So specifically, you mentioned what have people had doubts about. I think initially it was the lithium extraction technology, mostly because there wasn't a wide understanding of that. And now we're seeing, we've done a lot of work on investor education, if you like, to get out.
100%. That would be the biggest barrier to get through, is convincing people that it generally has validity.
Correct, yeah. And, you don't have these projects in Australia because we don't have the brines here. So perhaps for the Australian market, that's another reason why there's less understanding. But we've done a lot of work around that. And now there's more and more commercial projects of this nature being built around the world. So I think as those proof points have landed, there's less and less skepticism, if you like, because this is commercial technology that we're bolting together, essentially. I think that's one point. Another point for us was, initially we didn't have any brine flow in our projects. Well, now we have a commercial producing geothermal plant. We have wells, we have brines. We're pumping this up to the surface. We are producing lithium from it. We've been piloting it for years now as well. That's the other thing that we've done internally in-house. And that's another thing that's been sort of ticked off. We've developed our own in-house absorbent, our own particular one as well. So we have ticked off a lot of these proof points. I think, just to finish off, sorry for going on for too long, but in the next few months, we'll have our optimization plants up and running. This represents about a 40 million euro investment from the company. And this is the next generation after our pilot plants. This is a serious piece of kit. We'll be producing the first tons of lithium chemicals ever fully domestically produced in Europe. This is in the commissioning stage now, and will be in production, in a couple of months, essentially, once it's finished that commissioning phase. I think that will be a major proof point. And then I think the last piece of the puzzle really is the financing. So we've raised about 500 million Aussie over the course of our journey, but we still have the full phase 1 capex financing to go through. That will kick off once the last pieces of the puzzle lands in the next few weeks. So it should kick off in November, when we've got one last piece of land that we're waiting for. And we're also finishing our bridging engineering study, which should include some capex savings as well. Once we've got those capex savings in place, we've got that last piece of land, we'll kick off the financing. When we've got full debt and equity financing for phase 1, touch wood, then that will be, I think, the last proof point that investors need, that this is fully financed, it's ready to go, and then it's all about execution from there.
Well, you took the words out of my mouth about the milestone that you're approaching, because that's something that I saw. It's looming up on the timeline, and this year has really disappeared, and now it's, as we know, you'll be traveling over soon to sort of go through this whole milestone process. But when you're putting this into real sorts of almost stepping back and realizing that you're almost on the cusp of this, what is this really going to translate into the lithium battery market, especially given that we know everyone's been talking about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, but Europe has set some incredible precedents now as well, and each of the countries in a way are setting their own bars of trying to in-house and find lithium and materials and adopt these electric vehicles. So, for those that are maybe unfamiliar with that, what sort of scale are we talking about when you're looking at this looming, almost incredible benefit about to start trickling down?
Well, depending on which forecast you use, Europe is going to have built out between 1 and 1.4 terawatt hours of battery manufacturing capacity by 2030. That translates, very roughly speaking, to about 1 to 1.4 million tons of lithium chemicals per annum. Now, we're building a large project, 25,000 or 24,000 tons per annum lithium hydroxide from our phase 1. And, we've got multiple phases of developments after that. So we see a phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. We can grow in a very modular capacity across our Upper Rhine Valley large brine resource. It's the largest lithium resource in Europe. It's globally significant. But having said that, that barely touches the sides in terms of that demand in Europe. So we're talking phase 1, 25,000 tons per annum in a market that's going to be somewhere between 1 million and 1.4 million tons per annum in Europe. And that's not including the rest of the world's demands. China, Asia, ex-China, North America, where you've got huge battery manufacturing capacity being built. So we need all the lithium we can get, basically. Now, that's what I mean with doing things at scale with these new, more sustainable DLE type brine projects coming on stream. Oil and gas assistance is welcome, and it's an exciting time. I mean, I don't know any other market. There's going to be a lot of volatility along the way because it's a small market that's growing very, very quickly, the lithium market. So there's going to be ups and downs along the way over the next decade, that's for sure. But I don't know any other market that's growing at that rate. We're talking, 30% compound annual growth rate. So it's a really exciting space to be in.
No, exactly. I think there's been this disconnect really from the narrative and as you said, the share price and movements in, I wouldn't say lithium's commodity, but that whole appreciation of what it is, because the underlying story hasn't changed, but almost the flippers or the people that are just in and out quite quickly have really just sort of hedged against the markets. And as we said, it opens up that the opportunity is not changing. There is this direction, there is this tailwind. It's just that the volatility is always going to be there. And that's a affliction of just being in business and being on a listed exchange. But I mean, the brine, or the German Rhine Valley, the actual deposit you've got there, I mean, having access to the largest one in Europe, currently, who knows what comes online over the next 20 or 30 years, as we know we need more. I mean, acquiring and building out that project, if you go back in time to where it all started, I mean, how was this whole project and infrastructure really put together to where it is now?
Well, it was about, as I said, finding the right technology, the proven technology, and then once we got that, looking for the key ingredients that we needed. So we needed renewable heat, so a heated brine, a geothermal brine subsurface. And we wanted one that had sufficient flow rates coming to surface as well, and sufficient salinity within the brine. So there's really interesting brines, for instance, in Cornwall, there's a granitic brine which has high lithium grades, high heat, but doesn't have enough flow and doesn't have enough salinity in the brine either to drive this type of adsorption process. And, there's many other interesting brines around the world which we've filtered out of our process, essentially. So that's how we had that initial filtering process to identify the project. And then it was a matter of, in a downturn in the lithium market in 2018, it was a matter of building that portfolio of licenses and trying to build it up in the background and get it ready for when we could launch this, essentially. And then we were very fortunate to be able to raise quite a lot of capital quite early. That's enabled us to buy a lot of the existing infrastructure. So, and I mentioned we're a geothermal, commercial geothermal, renewable energy power producer. We have our own plant, we have our own wells. We bought that as a result of being able to raise that capital quite early. And that gives us great control because we're able to constantly do test work and iterate on the lithium extraction whilst we're producing renewable energy. So we've been simulating this in a live environment for quite a while now. And then build up our own Vulcan labs with full, analytics, and build our own pilot plants, our demo plants, build up that team in-house, buy the rigs that we need. So it was fortunate timing, really, being able to get into the market at the right time, raise that capital early, which has set us up really well now to execute on that phase 1 commercial.
And you said, tying back to the milestone of producing a lithium extract, going forward, clearly there's going to be buyers. Who has Vulcan Energy been engaging with, again, being between Germany and France? I know there's big car manufacturers in there, and you touched on LG, but who is really knocking on the door in your area and really wants to, I guess, almost have you to yourself and not really share you, given that there is just so much competition to get access to this supply?
So our biggest lithium offtaker is Stellantis, which covers Peugeot, Citroën in France, Opel in Germany, Fiat in Italy, and has other brands like Chrysler, Jeep, etc. under it as well. So it's a big car brand.
One that no one's ever heard of, but has almost every
It's
car.
the biggest car company no one's ever heard of. But they are our second largest shareholder. So they've invested significant equity in Vulcan, and they're our largest lithium offtaker. So I'd say they've been the most proactive up until now. But we also have lithium offtakes with Renault, with Volkswagen, as I mentioned as well.
Yes.
And that gives us an advantage when it comes to financing because, for instance, we have been designated preliminarily as a project of strategic national importance by the French government-backed Export Credit Agency, or ECA. And that means that during our upcoming financing process, we'll like to have a substantial part of our debt covered by ECA's government-backed ECA money. And that's because we're supplying the French autos with lithium, and it's strategically important for them. So there's a tremendous advantage to having those major sort of national brands, if you like, backing Vulcan into the next stage.
Yeah, I mean, the government acceptance of Vulcan has really been quite telling, given Germany and France. There's almost been this real acceptance and urgency for you guys. They really want to back you guys in a winner, and I think that's been quite telling in a lot of the announcements historically and showing the urgency from their point of view, but they're really going all in on you guys. And I can imagine you have quite a lot of frequent conversations, but almost the technology comes down to really the, foundation of the company, and where you can sort of execute it. And I mean, without putting words in your mouth, are there other opportunities if you're thinking, outside of your plants? I mean, is there scope to sort of start expanding that elsewhere, licensing opportunities? I'm not sure, again, if it can be applied as simple as that, but are there other opportunities that Vulcan's looking at, or even, thinking about the future, the next plants and the next stages, or is it very happy just to get this one up to scale, continue, because there's a lot of room to grow?
Well, we're being very disciplined. I mean, the company is very focused on executing phase one and doing that well, because that's going to be really important for our future as a business. And once we get phase one up and running, it should be highly profitable, really high margins, because we should be a very low-cost producer. There is a wider picture, though, which we are progressing in the background, which is we have multiple phases of development ahead of us in the Upper Rhine Valley. It's a huge resource. We're touching sort of, a small percentage of that, essentially, in our phase one area. And we see potential for multiple further phases in Germany, but also in France as well. So we can look at the relative merits of, do we build our next plant in Germany or in France, and perhaps the assistance mechanisms around that as well. And then, as you mentioned, we have our own, we're not just a project developer. We have our own lithium extraction technology.
Yes.
Now, other companies do as well. I mentioned Eramet, Livent, but there's not very many that have their own lithium extraction technology of this nature. A lot of project developers do a deal with a technology company to bring in the technology and give away project equity or pay higher rates for their own adsorbents. We're able to actually leverage that in the future as well. So, even for South American brines, we're able to look at potentially licensing out that technology. So we definitely do have our eye on that. It's more of a medium-term goal, but I think that's unrecognized value within Vulcan that hopefully we'll be able to tease out in the future. And I think on the renewable energy side as well, I think that's also sort of unrecognized value that we're looking at in the future. Once we've executed phase one, perhaps we start hiving off renewable energy projects and giving them a life of their own as well.
Yeah, well, that's where I see it is when you look at some of the, leaders in the industry, it almost comes down to, yes, they've got a project, but it's all the other aspects that people might not have considered. And you always look to Tesla. Yes, they make cars, but almost their battery has been almost the distinguishing factor of what they have accomplished, and everyone really wants to execute on that. And that comes down to technology. And of course, technology requires a good team. And you mentioned that throughout the time, the team has grown, where you could almost say from yourself and maybe a handful of others, upwards of 300, which is, over a period of time, an incredible benefit for a people, communities and countries, but quite a privilege for yourself to have executed that. But I mean, if you're drilling down on potentially just a handful of really key individuals that have helped achieve or are still currently achieving this mission, who have been really involved in the Vulcan acceleration and growth story?
In terms of individuals?
Yeah, if you can pick a few.
I mean, yeah, it's hard to pick individual. I mean, I obviously founded the company with Horst Kreuter, who brought in his own geothermal team into the company. And we recently we appointed a CEO who is my deputy CEO, Chris Marino. He's been working with us for the last year, has really helped to transform the business into that, from development into much more of an execution and operations company. And he's come from a background of, with Shell, Woodside, Santos, using that larger project execution discipline to take us to the next level. We've got a great head of commercial, Vincent Ledoux-Padias, who was appointed a lithium expert by the EU when they were doing their lithium investigations. He's been very pivotal in bringing in some of the key off-takers. We've got Christian Tragut, who is ex-BASF, 30 years building and operating their chemical plants, has come out of retirement because he loves the Vulcan story so much. And his quote to me last time I saw him is, he said, "I've never worked as hard as this, but I've never had so much fun." So, it's people like that, it's high quality individuals like that who have really made a difference to the business. It's too many to list.
I mean. It was sort of a bit of a harsh question to ask you to pick a few individually, but it is a testament to where it is, because you've had to really get unique skill sets, given that, as we said before, it's a very difficult sector of the market to really capitalize on, and we're seeing that. And I'd like to say it's going to get easier, but you can just see with the looming pressure on car manufacturers to find it for the EVs and the government sort of direction, that there's just going to be this real urgency to specialize and find the uniqueness. And that's where we tie it back to the oil and gas. Them starting to be more interested in it does show this new emerging speciality coming into lithium, which is quite exciting. And I know you've got the milestone coming up, and there's a fair bit coming in the coming weeks and months, really. But what can investors, I guess people following Vulcan Energy, expect coming out of the company over the coming period of time?
It's going to be an exciting time. Next 6 to 9 months is really pivotal for us. The rubber is hitting the road now. So we're expecting some updates leading into the completion of our bridging study. Now, this will bring us to basically a Class 2 estimate. And this is after the DFS, before we lock in an EPCM contractor. As we've announced recently, we're actually, on the upstream, we're going from 2 plants to 1 plant. So we're expecting some CapEx savings there. And there'll be updates on the resource as well in the coming weeks. So updates on the resource, updates, hopefully savings on CapEx, improved bridging study. That will be coming out in the coming weeks. Bridging study should be complete by the end of October. In parallel with that, we're commissioning our lithium extraction optimization plant as well. This is a product qualification and training facility, essentially, for our staff. Whilst we build a full commercial facility, they'll be training on this, producing product for customers. And that will get up and running. So we'll have commissioning updates along the way, but that will formally get up and running likely end of October. And then we'll have sort of a grand opening for that as well. I think that will be a very important psychological point, because, it's a serious piece of kit. And I think for some people, that's the psychological hurdle that they've been waiting for. So that will be something else. And then, we launch into financing, and we're looking at strategic partners, including oil and gas companies, chemicals companies, coming in at a project level, potentially doing a project sort of JV level sell down just for phase 1 for up to 50%. There should be updates on that along the way on the equity side. On the debt side, that will be led by BNP Paribas. We've already done the market sounding, very good feedback from that exercise. Hopefully some government support there as well, ECA support, possibly grants as well. We are applying for those. So that could be potentially a catalyst, but we can't promise anything there. It's a competitive process. So there'll be a lot of financing, milestones, I think, coming up. And then obviously once we've completed the financing, which looking like Q2 next year, that will be sort of the really big milestone, I think, that we're leading up to. Because once that's done, we're fully ready to go.
Yeah, I think that's the real crux of what a lot of people would, I'd say, are waiting for. Because, given the acceleration of lithium now and the need, it's about really competing who's going to get there first and who's really going to drive the the product into the market. But no, I appreciate your time on the show today, Francis. I'm looking forward to having you back when you get back from your multiple travels and hearing how the Milestone opening goes, because I think that's going to be quite as you said, an emotional relief for a lot of people and a success. And yeah, we'll see what happens in the future. But yeah, thank you for speaking on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me on, Ben. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Market Bull podcast. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to like and subscribe. You can follow the Market Bull on our socials at Twitter and LinkedIn by searching the Market Bull. You can also subscribe to our newsletter on the website by visiting www.themarketbull.com.au.